What's the craziest story that you've heard that still gives you chills to this day? Story 1. Several years ago, at around 10 p.m. or so, I was dispatched in words, I was a deputy then, in words to call about a lady hearing strange noises outside. I arrived at her house, which is on the corner of two small streets with no lamps. The entrance to her home is on one street, and the entrance to her driveway and carport is on the side street. Anyway, I arrive and knock on the front door. The lady politely asked me to identify myself, and after reassuring her that I was an officer, she steps outside, wringing her hands and telling me how embarrassed she was to have called. This short, chubby older lady then leads me around the side of her home to her carport, all while telling me that she was preparing to leave and heard scraping and moaning noises on her carport and was worried something or someone was out there. I searched her carport, yard, and even her home and found nothing. As she was older and lived alone, the yard and carport were mostly unkempt, and I found no signs of anything being trampled or moved on the dusty carport. I led the lady around, showing her the distinct lack of evidence, and told her I would keep an eye on her home for the rest of my shift. She climbs into her car and leaves shortly after. A few hours later, she calls back, saying there is blood on door going into her home from the carport. I did not think much about it, as I had driven by her home several times and did not see anything strange. When I arrived now, she was parked on the street in front of her driveway, with the lights pointing at her house. I approach her car and she is calm but confused. She tells me she pulled into the carport and saw what she thought was blood on the door. She said she backed out onto the street and called. She was not upset, but said she thought it best to call since she heard noises earlier. I did not think there was much to this, and really started to think the lady was a bit uneasy. I walked up the driveway and could see something on the door as I was walking. Did not see any footprints or tire tracks in the mud. As I got on the carport, I saw the substance on the door was red, and there was a lot of it. Then I smelled it. It was most definitely blood, and it was everywhere. The blood started about halfway up the carport and continued to the door. There were 3 small steps up to the door, and they were dripping with blood. On the door, the blood was smeared with bloody handprints. There were several handprints on the door, the knob, and the glass, and it was smeared all over the door, frame, and walls beside the door. The way the blood was smeared, it looked as if someone had fallen against the door while bleeding heavily, then pounded on and tried to open the door. The door was still locked, and there were no bloody drips or footprints leading away from the steps. I called for my supervisor and a canine unit. By now I was alarmed a bit, as this was a lot of blood. I had the lady turn off her car and stayed by her until my supervisor, zone partner, and canine officer arrived. Sergeant began roping off the home with crime scene tape, and I prepared to join the canine officer for a track. My zone partner stayed behind to get a statement from the lady. Before leaving, while the blood was still fresh, I helped my partner collect samples of the blood. We scooped a small amount into a driving under the influence blood sample kit, then used a paper towel and absorbed a huge amount and put it in a large evidence bag. The dog never got a scent. We tracked for over an hour, searched 5 homes and a large portion of woods across from the lady's home, and never found anything. No blood, no body, no footprints. None of the neighbors heard anything, and dispatch never received any calls. None of the hospitals in our county or any of the surrounding counties reported any patients with significant injuries that would support the amount of blood we found. Story 2. 7 or 8 years ago, during a stretch of hot, dry days in August, I attended a bluegrass festival at Thomas Point Beach in Brunswick, Maine. The headliner of the festival that year was Ralph Stanley, who had been on the bluegrass scene since the late 1940s, but had been recently cast into the national spotlight because his song in quotes, "Oh Death in Words," had been included in the "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" soundtrack. On the day of Ralph Stanley's performance, I was at the front left of the stage. Ralph was dressed in black from his boots to his cowboy hat, and I remember thinking he must have been sweltering in the heat. It was a typical in-words but talented in-words performance. But after 3 songs, the rest of the band stopped playing, and Ralph grabbed his mic in words and stepped forward a few paces. After a few moments, he started singing his new big hit in quotes, "Oh Death," in words in his old quavery voice. After just a couple lines, I noticed several of the people standing around me were turning away from the stage. When I turned my head to see what was happening, I realized I was standing at the edge of a cleared space within the crowd, at the center of which was a heavyset woman, splayed on her back with someone kneeling next to her, giving her cardiopulmonary resuscitation in words. Ralph Stanley is extremely old, and I imagine that he could not see what was happening in parentheses, even though it was no more than 30 feet away from the stage in parentheses. So he just continued to sing, in quotes, "You run my life right out of my soul. Oh, death, please consider my age. Please do not take me at this stage," ellipsis in words. I remember a woman standing beside me, a stranger, touched my arm, and without taking her eyes away from the woman on the ground, said, in quotes, "Do you hear this flipping song, question mark? Is this happening right now? Question mark in words." By the time the song had ended, the man had stopped giving the woman cardiopulmonary resuscitation in words. She was dead. We learned later it was a heart attack. The crowd was stunned and totally silent, and in the silence you could hear the sound of ambulance siren growing in the distance. Later that night, my friend struck up a conversation with the fiddle player from Ralph Stanley's band after getting an autograph. He invited him to come jam with the band in their bus. During a whiskey break between jams, my friend asked the band members something along the lines of, in quotes, "So that was pretty intense out there today, huh? Question mark in words." The fiddle player laughed and said, in quotes, "Sheesh, that has happened like 4 times in words," and took a shot of whiskey. Story 3. My granddad fought in World War II and told a fair few stories about his experiences before he died. But there was one that really sticks. Before tanks entered towns, he would have to drive a Jeep into a town to look for 88mm guns. Obviously a very risky job, and he was blown out of his Jeep at one point, getting shrapnel lodged in his leg till the day he died. However, at one point they had finished their rounds of a village and signaled the all clear. So the infantry start their assault, all running towards the closest building, when an anti-tank shell flies past him, decapitating a soldier. Everyone drops to the ground to watch the soldier keep running headless another 100 meters into the village, blood spurting everywhere. Seemed like something you would not forget in a while. Story 4, I posted this in another thread a while ago. I am sure I am late and this will get buried, but here goes. 2 summers ago, I was on my way home from my boyfriend's house. About a mile or so from the highway, there is a cut-off road that turns off onto a dirt drive, way to what used to be a slaughterhouse. Now they just use it for cattle sales. One night it was about 1 a.m. I was driving along minding my own business, when I see that up ahead there is a chicken truck halfway in the main road, halfway in the slaughterhouse driveway. I slow down to a crawl, and as I get closer, I see a man running around from the back of the building to the truck. He steps up to open the cab door, but it must have been locked because he was unsuccessful at opening it. He turns and starts running toward the road, waving a flashlight, I think, as I am approaching. I am panicking at this point, so I kind of swerve around him, and he kind of smacked my passenger door and is screaming. I have no idea what I did not stop. I gunned it. I drive to the stop sign up ahead, and in my rear view, I see another dude coming running and hit the first guy in the head with what looks like a 2x4, and the guy fell down in the road. I sped off and pull over in a parking lot a couple of 100 yards away. I know at this point you are thinking what a coward. She did not help him, but it was late at night and dark, and I was alone and scared. I called the cops and told them what had happened. They said they would send a cop to check it out, but I did not stick around to check. About 2 weeks later, they found a body in the river a few miles away. I am almost positive it was the same guy. They even mentioned an anonymous 911 call on the news. It was chalked up to a domestic violence case because apparently the guy had been sleeping with the other's wife, which also happened to be his son. Messed up. It literally took me months to convince myself that it was not my fault and that I could not have done anything to save him. I guess maybe it was my fault. I do not know. But I do know that if I had stopped, we might have both been in that river. Story 5. About 35 years ago, my newlywed uncle and his bride were driving back from their honeymoon in Texas to their home in Campeche, in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. Their Volkswagen Beetle had acted up towards the end of their first day of driving the roads in Mexico back then, were horrible, and a drive from the Texas border to Campeche was close to 24 hours. And driving on those roads more than 8 hours was really wearing. So they had planned on taking 3 days to get home, and they had to make a 2-day unplanned stay in some town while the car was repaired. So when they got underway, they decided to drive through and get home, since they needed to get back to work. So by the early evening of their second day of actual driving, they came into a small town somewhere in the state of Veracruz. They pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of town to fuel up and also to eat dinner. There was a small taco stand on the edge of the gas station, and they decided to dine there. The old man running the stand was very friendly, and before they knew it, they were telling him all about their honeymoon in the United States. When they finished eating, they thanked the owner and started to get up to leave when the man asked them where they were planning to stay. My uncle answered that they were planning to keep driving through the night. My uncle said the man became visibly agitated and encouraged them to find a hotel, but my uncle told him they really wanted to get home and still have 1 day of rest before having to go back to work. The old man told him it would not be safe to drive off at night. He told my uncle that strange things had been happening on the road. He showed them a newspaper article about a bus that had gone missing a few days before. He said he had seen that bus drive off and had never reached the next town down the road, and search parties had not found anything, despite the fact that there was nothing between this town and the next. My aunt became a bit frightened, but my uncle laughed it off. So a few minutes later they were back in the Beetle and they drove off. A few miles down the road they ran into a fog bank, which is not a strange event in the Sierras, and quickly lost sight of the town behind them. Shortly after driving into the fog bank, they began to see a lot of lights, both stationary and moving, ahead of them, so my uncle slowed down. He said they drove by what seemed to be some sort of work crew, like a road repair crew or something like that, and just as they were driving by the work site, the fog was thick enough that they could not quite see any of the equipment clearly, but they could see equipment and people moving around the road surface improve fantastically and curved off to the right. The road they had been on since leaving the gas station was potholed, rough and loud, but now the road was smooth and the tires moved over it with barely a whisper. The improved road surface helped convince my uncle that they had just driven by the crew that was repairing the road. He said that as they drove, they kept seeing work crews along the side of the road every now and then. After about an hour of driving, my aunt asked my uncle if he had noticed that there was no other traffic moving in the same direction they were traveling. Every now and then, there would be a vehicle going in the opposite direction. Most of them seemed to be large trucks and buses, but no other traffic in front or behind them going their way. After she mentioned this, my uncle began to pay attention and realized she was right. He thought this was strange because while they had been eating at the gas station, there had been a constant flow of traffic on the road, but now they seemed to be the only car on their lane. After another 20 or 30 minutes of driving, still with no traffic on their lane, and after having driven by several more work crews and more trucks going in the opposite direction, my aunt told my uncle that there was definitely something weird going on. She told him to pay attention to the writing on the side of the next truck that drove by them. So when they saw another truck moving towards them, my uncle slowed down and tried to keep his eyes on the truck. He said that the writing on the side of the trailer seemed to be some sort of advertisement, but the writing was in an alphabet he had never seen. He said it looked like a mix of Korean, Japanese, Chinese, and some Arabic language. The next truck was the same. Then he began to pay attention to the work crews. He said the equipment sort of looked like what you would expect to see in a large work site, but the equipment looked really clean and futuristic, and he even thought that the people looked really tall and moved like insects. He could not really explain what that meant. He just said they moved like insects. He told my aunt that they would drive until they either got to the next town or they got to a half tank of fuel. They drove several more hours before they reached the half tank mark. My uncle stopped the car, reached under the seat for his pistol, and got out. He said that he felt weird, like out of place as soon as he got out. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up, and it took a real act of will not to scream like a little girl and jump back in the car. He saw a truck coming towards him on the other lane. The truck began to slow down as if it was going to stop in front of him, and that is when he lost it and jumped back into the car, did a tight U-turn and took off. In his rearview mirror, he saw the truck stop, and then he lost it in the fog. The drive back was almost exactly like their drive had been so far. Work crews on the side of the road, no traffic in their lane, and trucks in the opposite lane. They drove until they hit the curve on the road, drove by the road crew and out of the fog back into the rough road, and eventually back to the same gas station where they had had dinner. They found a nice spot near the taco stand and slept a few hours. They were awakened by the old man knocking on my uncle's door. He told them he was very relieved that they had decided to stay. My uncle told him that they had not stayed, that they had gotten on the road, but that things got really weird by that curve where the road crew was. The old man told him there was no curve on that road, that the road was straight from there to the next town about 30 miles away. My uncle insisted that they had taken a right turn, where a road crew was working, and that they had driven for about 3 hours without ever driving into the next town. My uncle would have kept believing that, except that after eating and getting another tank of gas, they got back on the same road and drove for almost an hour before driving into the next town, never having seen a road crew, never having taken a curve to the right, and never having left the potholed, rough, loud road. Story 6. A few years ago, a girl in my suburb had an episode in words, I guess that is what you call it, in words, and harmed her mother, father, and one of her sisters, while stabbing her other sister who attempted to escape. She had mental issues in words, schizophrenia, amongst others in words, and had been seeking help. There is a bit of debate in the area whether the girl was on meds or refusing meds due to her religious beliefs. Regardless, she was fairly well known to be sick. It turns out that a guy I used to work with was dating this girl at the time. He was trying to help her and was ultimately trying to end things about that time. But he told me something about that day that truly gave me chills. The girl had come home from therapy that day. She came into the house, went and sat in her room for an hour or so in silence. No arguments, no disagreements or grievances, not even mutterings. When she exited the room, she calmly went around the house, with the rest of the family unaware, and deadlocked the doors and locked the windows before she went around harming them. The surviving sister managed to break a window and escape, and eventually the girl made her way outside and just sat on the step and waited until she was obviously taken into custody. She went around and locked the doors and windows first. Chilling. Story 7. Some days Dad would just get, I suppose you would describe it as a waiting sort of mood. Apprehensive is the word, I think. As if he were bracing for something. Towards the end of the day on these days, he would briefly lighten up before dread flickered over his face. This was something I grew accustomed to over the years and never questioned. Then Pop died. At the time, we knew he was dying. He worked alongside asbestos decades ago and had mesothelioma. It was hard to watch him deteriorate, and at the time all I noticed about my own father was him struggling to remain positive. This was his father after all. It would be any day, they told us. They did not know when, but Pop was close. One morning after spending the night at my dad's house, I awoke to him sitting at the dining room table, head in his hands. I sat. He looked at me, and I noticed how tired he was. I would not know until later that he had been awake in that spot from 2 a.m. onwards. In quotes, he is gone, period, in words in quotes. Gone, question mark. I knew what he meant, but was confused. In quotes, I did not hear the phone ring, period, in words. He hesitated and then told me about the ladies in their kitchen. It is never in the same place. Sometimes it is a house he walks into, floating as one tends to do in dreams. Once it was a windmill in a field. Once it was a cave. The setting never matters, he said, because it is the same kitchen when you walk through the threshold. The same cabinets, the same paint, the same food. He told me about the women, his grandmother, his maternal great-grandmother, and his paternal great-grandmother. Women who he knew in his lifetime who had long passed on. Never more or less, never different, just the same women in the same kitchen. In quotes, they never speak comma, he told me softly. Ellipsis, not at first, period, in words. This dream started a series of dreams, all ending the same way in this kitchen, with these females not speaking. The dreams could go anywhere from several days to a week or more. He told me that every night they did not speak to him, only made him more and more anxious, almost sick. And this was when I realized that I had seen him that way so many times before. In quotes, ellipsis, then you ellipsis. I ellipsis walk in one night, ellipsis last night. I had to cross a highway and swim to get to a tiny house where it was ellipsis walked in, and they were sitting at the table. ellipsis in words, he said that he never gets to sit down. The women look up at him, teacups filled, one extra cup waiting in an empty seat. They look as though they have been interrupted during a grave conversation. And then one randomly says in quotes, "Sit down, comma, Jeffrey," period in words. He was silent after saying this, rubbing his eyes and flexing his other hand. I waited for him to gather himself, and when he had, he told me that was the end of it. Of not just that one dream, but the sequence of them and of something else. I still did not understand, and so he, quietly, provided the answer. That these dreams indicate that someone he is close to is going to pass on. That the women only invite him to sit when the person is gone. This last one in the sequence had awoken him around 2 a.m., and he knew without having to be told. He called the hospital, talked to his grieving mother, who confirmed she had just been about to call him and his siblings with the news. We had Pop's funeral. We lowered him into the ground. I did not say anything about the dreams. How much of that could I believe? I was 15 then, still struggling with high school and the drama that came along with it. I was not about to tell my friends about these freaky dreams my dad claimed to have. Years passed, from freshman in high school to freshman in college. I found a niche and flourished, enjoying my newfound freedom. It had been so long since I had thought about my dad's dreams of the kitchen and the women. One of my new friends brought a flyer to my dorm one night, excitedly telling me that Lady D was coming to the campus, that she was the real deal sort of psychic, and I had to go. It would be fun. So I went. The woman I met drew a small crowd, and we sat in a large circle around her in our common area. She told us about fortunes and how she had a guide on the spirit plane. It was common stuff you hear about with so-called psychics. She finally allowed us to ask questions, and I, on a whim, asked her if she believed in spirits who watched over each person. Like guardian angels or that sort of thing, I said. I will never forget what she said. In quotes, "One of the women who watches over your father is here with you. Period, open bracket. Spirit companion, close bracket, says he can see her in a kitchen, period. Do not worry, comma. Though colon, the fact she is here means no one is about to die, period, in word story 8. Here is a true one that happened to me. When I first started at university, I had nowhere to live due to an oversight by the university. I knew a guy from a forum and online game that was on my course, and I asked to stay at his house until I could find my own place, and after much begging, he reluctantly agreed. So I arrived at his house, and all of his housemates were already living there, so I had to sleep on the sofa. A day or two later, his next-door neighbor arrived, also a student. She was the first to move into the 5-bedroom house. We quickly became friends, and she invited me to sleep in one of her spare rooms. So the first night I slept there, I woke up in the night and turned over to see a young woman, probably early 30s, older than the girl that was living there in words, wearing a bonnet and sat in a chair at the side of my bed knitting. I immediately knew what I was seeing and did not panic, and was not scared in the slightest, and quickly went back to sleep. Now that is the creepy part. A few days later, I found my own place to live, so I moved out of my new friend's bedroom, and then a few more days later, the girl whose bedroom it was to be moved in. She reported seeing exactly the same thing as me to my friend, and I had never told anyone about it, so it could not have been passed on and then imagined. I still do not believe in ghosts, but I swear to this day that I saw one in that bedroom. Story 9. On March 23, 1994, the medical examiner viewed the body of Ronald Opus and concluded that he died from a shotgun wound to the head. Mr. Opus had jumped from the top of a 10-story building intending to commit suicide. He left a note to the effect indicating his despondency. As he fell past the 9th floor, his life was interrupted by a shotgun blast passing through a window, which killed him instantly. Neither the shooter nor the deceased was aware that a safety net had been installed just below the 8th floor level to protect some building workers, and that Ronald Opus would not have been able to complete his suicide the way he had planned. The room on the 9th floor where the shotgun blast emanated was occupied by an elderly man and his wife. They were arguing vigorously, and he was threatening her with a shotgun. The man was so upset that when he pulled the trigger, he completely missed his wife, and the pellets went through the window, striking Mr. Opus. When one intends to harm subject A, but harms subject B in the attempt, One is guilty of the harm to subject B. When confronted with the charge, the old man and his wife were both adamant, and both said that they thought the shotgun was not loaded. The old man said it was a long-standing habit to threaten his wife with the unloaded shotgun. He had no intention to harm her. Therefore, the death of Mr. Opus appeared to be an accident, that is, assuming the gun had been accidentally loaded. The continuing investigation turned up a witness who saw the old couple's son loading the shotgun about 6 weeks prior to the fatal accident. It transpired that the old lady had cut off her son's financial support, and the son, knowing the propensity of his father to use the shotgun threateningly, loaded the gun with the expectation that his father would harm his mother. Since the loader of the gun was aware of this, he was guilty of the death even though he did not actually pull the trigger. The case now becomes one of responsibility on the part of the son for the death of Ronald Opus. Now comes the exquisite twist. Further investigation revealed that the son was, in fact, Ronald Opus. He had become increasingly despondent over the failure of his attempt to engineer his mother's harm. This led him to jump off the 10-story building on March 23rd, only to be struck by a shotgun blast passing through the 9th-story window. The son, Ronald Opus, had actually caused his own death, so the medical examiner closed the case as a suicide. Story 10. Once upon a time, there was a man made entirely out of pillows. His body was a pillow, his head was a pillow, all his fingers were pillows. Even his toes were pillows. He was about 9 feet tall. So the pillow man had a very sad job. He also had magical powers that gave him the ability to travel through time. His job was to travel back in time and visit children who would grow up to live difficult lives. And he would convince these children to end things early rather than living the rest of their miserable life that he knew about from the future. The pillow man went to visit a little girl one day who he knew would grow up to have an awful life. He told her about all the horrible things that would happen to her when she grew up, but she didn't believe him. She told the pillow man, "I'm happy, Mr. Pillowman. I've always been happy, and I'll always be happy." And the pillow man looked at this happy little girl and just knew he couldn't convince her. He went back to her as an adult, and she asked him, "Why didn't you convince me, Mr. Pillowman? Why did you let me live this horrible life?" And the pillowman said, "You were such a happy little girl." And she said, "But Mr. Pillowman, I've never been happy." And he watched as this grown-up girl harmed herself because of all the horrible things that he could have prevented. Now the pillow man had a very sad job because if he was successful, then a very young child would die. But if he was unsuccessful, then a little child would live and grow up in a horrible life. The pillow man became very sad about his job, so decided to do one final job, and then that would be it. So the pillow man went back in time for the last time and found a little boy sitting behind a tree. He called out to the boy, "I want to talk to you, little boy." And the boy came out. But it was not a boy at all. It was the little pillow boy from the past. And the pillow man told the pillow boy about all the awful things that he would grow up to do and the horrible job he would have. And the little boy understood instantly. He took a little tank of gasoline and poured it all over himself. Then he told the pillow man, "Will you tell my mommy I won't be one for dinner?" And the pillow man said yes, lying of course. The pillow boy struck a match and went up in flames. The pillow man stood there, fading away from reality. And the last thing he heard was the screams and cries for help from all the little children who would grow up to live horrible lives that he would never again help. The Pillow Man by Martin McDonough. Story 11/9/11 affected everyone in my area really badly. In parentheses, I grew up in northern New Jersey, right across the Hudson River, in parentheses. I remember most vividly the thick black smoke that covered the skyline for a week, the sadness of everyone, and how everything just came to a standstill while the local hospitals were hectic. My mom's good friend's husband was a Port Authority officer, and the day after we heard that after responding to the attack, he wasn't back home, or to be heard of from anyone. My family spent a lot of time with her, trying to assure her that whatever his situation, things were going to be all right. On the 13th, she told us that she got a call from a random number and answered, only to have it be her husband. He said that he was stuck under the rubble, and that even though he was going to die, he helped a few people out and knew that this was the end. She said he kept going on and on about how he was going to be fine, that this was what his life was meant for, and that she should try to contact the people he helped to get out. Of course, subject matter like this is dark and hard to stomach, but the way she talked about it gave me chills, because it seemed like she and her husband, in a time of chaos and frenzy, were both calm and rationalized what had happened. It still gives me chills thinking about sitting in her living room and having her calmly explain what he said, and sort of accepting what happened to him and in general. His body in parentheses, or what was left of it in parentheses, was found a week later during cleanup. Story 12. Mid-October 2001. I was 13 years old at the time. My family, including grandpa, uncle, mom, sister, and I, were visiting our cousins on their lumberyard farm. The farm was very large and located in the thick boreal forest with winding rivers and primarily farmland. Being entrepreneurs, my cousins owned the lumberyard, the surrounding farmland, a log cabin house business, and rent out log hunting shacks to hunters primarily from United States on their land. I have included a diagram of the layout of the farm, so it will be easier to understand where we were and what happened. My cousin Banner is a year younger than I am. He has a large family, but most of his brothers are quite younger than the rest of us. His sister and my sister were around the same age, 3 years younger than I am. We would spend our days exploring and playing in the beautiful nature that surrounded us. We would spend our evenings camping out in one of the work shacks that was in the lumberyard, watching old movies on a small TV. The events that took place that night all began in this work shack. At approx 10 p.m., my cousin and I were in our sleeping bags, watching the movie Son-in-Law. We were camping out in the work shack as usual. It was a nice night and the moonlight was enough to make our way around outside. Banner heard a tap on the window and sat up to see if an animal was outside. Then we heard the door creak open, and it stayed open just a crack. Seconds later, we heard screaming coming from the west, and we bolted upright and went outside. I noticed a rustling in the trees, but thought nothing of it. Our sisters were running from the nearby forest path coming from the grandparents' house, in parentheses, see map in parentheses. We thought they were joking around, but when they started screaming our names, we met them halfway. They decided to come to the work shack and bug us. On their way through the trees, they saw a man standing near the path in the trees staring at them. They thought it was one of us and started talking to him. He began to mumble with his arms out and walk towards them. They realized they didn't know him and ran through the trees to us screaming. After learning this, we panicked. We hopped on Banner's quad, the girls hanging on the back, and he drove east away from the stranger. We were going to Banner's house, in parentheses, see map in parentheses, when we saw a man standing in the middle of the gravel road. He had one hand to his face and one reaching out with palm towards us. We swerved off into the ditch and kept going to Banner's house. Once we got to his house, we turned on all the lights we could reach, and Banner grabbed a rifle from the gun cabinet, and we perched ourselves in the garage with the doors locked. Our family was still visiting at our grandparents' house, and we were alone. Thinking back, I am mad because we should have gone directly to our grandparents' house, but with the stranger blocking the way, we were too scared and not thinking. We also didn't have time to let our sisters explain to us that our parents were still down the road at grandparents. We heard a gunshot off in the distance. We sat there terrified for another 5-10 minutes before we heard the second shot that sounded like it was right beside us. It was only a matter of a minute or less before we heard the third. Almost immediately after, in parentheses, although it felt like eternity in parentheses, we heard familiar voices yelling our names and enter the house. Our parents burst through the garage door and tell us to hurry out to the truck. Once in the truck, we begged them to tell us what's going on, and they said to be quiet and that we are going back to grandparents' house. In the moonlight, I could see 2 figures laying in the grass about 30 feet from the house. Once at grandparents, we were herded into the basement and instructed to stay there until told. I could hear conversations upstairs were full of tension and nervousness, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. The police showed up about 30-40 minutes later, and we were asked to tell our versions of events. Then we were taken to another relative's house who lived in a nearby town. We didn't learn what had happened. No one would tell us. Then word started to spread. I had a serious conversation with my uncle years later to find out the whole story. My cousins were renting a hunting shack on their land, out to 3 hunters from the States, 2 brothers and their father. One of the brothers had some sort of mental illness, but could function perfectly fine most of the time in parentheses, or so they say in parentheses. The police found blood, pieces of human tongue, and cut rope in parentheses. Two had been bound together in parentheses in the shack. Outside, there were 3 sets of footprints going the same direction, but different paths. It is one escaped before the other did. The later tried to follow, but couldn't keep up. The third set of prints led directly to the work shack my cousin and I were staying in, and then veered off to where my sister saw the first man, then doubled back to the work shack. This is where the sane brother's body was found shot in the head. Prince then followed the road behind our quad to the father who was shot in the stomach. In parentheses, he survived in parentheses. Banner's dad and my uncle had heard the first shot. They went directly to the work shack because they knew we were sleeping there. They found the dead body of the sane brother. They loaded the rifle in the back of the truck. They drove up the road to Banner's house just as the insane brother had shot the father. Banner's dad shot and killed the insane brother as he aimed the rifle up towards them. They then found us, and the rest is history. Story 13. About 5 years ago, I was over my friend's house. The hot water tank had just broke, so a group of friends had stopped by to help. Now the thing is, his dad built the house a couple of years before. Everything was new, and his dad or family had built and installed everything. Well, as we removed some wood that they used to fuel a wood-bearing stove, we noticed the cement wall was cracked. So after the hot water got fixed, his dad agreed to buy us lunch and dinner if we repaired the wall. So the first thing we did was remove a chunk of cement that was loose. As we pried it out, one of my friends noticed an old locked wooden box. So we called his parents down since we had no clue what this was. Well, his parents didn't know either, so we start to get freaked out. My friend is an only child, and this wall was put up when the house was constructed. So we get the box and notice there is a very crude carving on this box. It read, "I will be back 3/23/14. So needless to say, everyone's pucker factor is at 100. So my friend's dad took the box and put it to the side so we can keep working on this wall. After we finished that night, my friend's dad grabbed some tools to open this box. After about 20 minutes of working, he pries the lock off, and the only thing in this box is a note. The only thing scribbled on this note is, "Why did you open this without me?" So naturally, my friend's dad calls all of his family who worked on the house, and they all insist that they are not responsible for this box. So needless to say, next year, everyone who was there that day will be back in that house on the 23rd of March to see who comes back or what happens. Story 14. This is a completely true story. I didn't exaggerate or add any details. Enjoy. This happened several years ago when I was 19. It was sometime during the summer, probably in June. I was staying with my best friend. She lived with her grandparents. And at about 11 p.m., we decided we would drive down to see some friends in Tulsa, which is about 4 hours away from where we are in KC. Never mind the fact that we would be arriving around 3 a.m. It was the weekend, so no doubt our friends would be up partying at that time. So we got some snacks and hit the road. Now, we had driven to Tulsa many times over the years, but the only route we knew was Route 69, which is this little 2-lane highway. We would have preferred to take the interstate since it was nighttime. We'd only ever made the drive during the day, but we couldn't find a map. Her grandparents didn't have internet access, and this was just before the days of GPS. So we had to take the route we knew. Route 69 between KC and Tulsa basically goes through the middle of nowhere. The entire drive you're passing through cornfields or the woods. There are no lights but your headlights at night, and no cell phone service the entire way. At least this is how it was then. I haven't driven that road since that night. Basically, we were banking on a smooth journey the whole way, or we'd be totally effed. We had no idea when we left just how badly things could potentially turn out. We were having a great time, listening to the radio, eating our snacks, windows down. We were about halfway there when things started to get weird. Remember, this is a 4-hour trip, so we were 2 hours into the middle of nowhere with no cell service, and we were approaching the point of no return. We had just enough gas to either get us there or back home, so we had to either go the whole way or turn around. At this point, there were also woods on either side of us, starting just a few yards from the road on each side. Then the weirdness began. We noticed some blood on the road in the other lane. No big deal, we figured someone must have hit a deer, which is very, very common in that area. But as we kept driving, there was more blood. and more blood, and more blood. Over the course of 10 miles or so, the amount of blood on the road grew from a small splattering to a massive pool, covering about 3 car lengths, still in the other lane, running off into the woods. This is when we start to realize that something isn't right. Not only was it an extremely large amount of blood, more than there could ever possibly be just from hitting a deer, but that's all there was. Just blood. There were no animal parts of any kind, not even random chunks of fur, no broken glass or other car wreckage. Nothing. Just a massive amount of blood on the road. We also realized that we hadn't passed a single other car the entire time, and considering that the blood was on the other side of the road, if someone had hit an animal and their car was still drivable, it would have passed us a while back. Not only that, but the blood was very, very fresh. Whatever had happened within the last couple of hours at the most. Naturally, we were starting to freak out. Neither one of us is the type to panic or assume the worst, but we had seen a lot of horror movies, and I'm sure that you all are aware of how a lot of horror movies start. Something just felt really, really off too. Even before we realized there was something beyond roadkill happening, we both got a gut feeling that something was very wrong. Anyway, like I said before, we had pretty much reached the point of no return. We had to decide whether to turn around and go home or keep driving, and we had to decide quickly. Well, that decision was made for us. Suddenly, we arrived at a roadblock. I literally had to slam on my brakes to avoid hitting it. Things felt even weirder. For one thing, there were no previous signs warning that the road was going to be closed. Second, they barely looked authentic. They were old, the white and orange striped sawhorse kind, and the wood was rotting. You could hardly make out the letters in the words "road closed." And finally, there wasn't any sort of detour, or so we thought. After sitting there for a minute, trying to make any sense of what was going on, nearing a state of panic, we realized that there was a detour. Off to the side of the road, there was a small, homemade, crooked edge sign with the word detour, yes, spelled that way, painted on it, in dripping red letters. Seriously, see what I mean about cheesy details? I would have come up with something better had I made this up, but that's just what happened. The sign pointed to a narrow, overgrown, obviously rarely used dirt road that led off into the pitch-black woods. And as far as we could see, it led away from the direction of the highway. This was when we decided, obviously, that we were getting the hell out of there. And I don't know what possessed us to do this, but we decided to switch drivers. We both got out of the car and ran to switch. And as we got back into the car, the windows were still down. We definitely heard some voices and movement in the woods, very close to the edge, on both sides of the road. My friend was now driving, and she took off as fast as my crappy little car could go. We didn't look back. We just kept driving until we were back to civilization. To this day, we have no idea what really happened in the woods that night. When we got back to her grandparents' house, we just snuck in and eventually went to sleep. Thank God whatever was out there, wasn't a little better at whatever the hell they were doing. Road spikes to puncture tires, anyone? They must have been new at the whole psycho killer game. Because I really feel like we very, very narrowly escaped getting Kansas chainsaw massacred out there. Story 15. This may get buried, but I'm going to tell it anyways. Well, I haven't heard this story, but it did happen to me, and it gave me some serious chills. I grew up in a small town, like 4,000, 5,000 people small. Everyone in our high school pretty much grew up together, knew each other, were friends, etc. When this story occurred, I was in the military and was on a leave for a week right after basic training boot camp. It was midsummer and my friends wanted to go out for a drink to hang out before I left for a long time. I don't drink, so I was the designated driver, and I cut them off around 1 p.m. or so. Nobody was drunk, I was just tired as all hell and wanted to get home for some much-needed rest. I decided to drive through my town's main street, which is actually really poorly lit and has a lot of empty lots alleys. I was in a 4-door car, I think it was a Mercury Sable, a piece of junk one in LOL, and as I was driving I noticed a woman walking on the sidewalk. She looked super familiar, and after a couple of seconds I recognized her as Erin, a really good friend and former girlfriend from high school. I parked a little ahead of her and got out. As soon as she saw me, she knew who it was, so we hugged and she asked me about boot camp and etc., etc. While we were talking, I noticed that there were two guys in dark clothing that were hanging around who had probably been following her. I knew something was wrong about it, so I stepped in front of Aaron. Now I'm not a small guy. Back then, I was around 6'1" and 190 pounds of pure muscle, and these punks didn't look too athletic. I almost yelled at them, "Can I help you, gentlemen?" They didn't respond and just kind of stood there. I didn't like that situation at all, so I told Aaron to get in the car, and once she was in, I followed, pulling away from the curb pretty fast. I glanced in the rear mirror and saw about 6 guys piling out of an alley that was 20th in front of where I picked up Aaron, and they looked like the we're talking to the 2 guys I saw. I didn't and still don't want to even think what they were going to do to her if I wasn't there at that exact time and place. Gives me the serious creeps. Glad I was stupid enough to take the long way home, though. Story 16. When I was between junior and senior years at college, I stayed at my townhouse by myself while my roommates went home for the summer. That year, a string of break-ins was reported in my neighborhood. Girls would wake up to a man in their bedroom staring at them. He would run out when they saw him. Nothing was ever stolen and nobody was ever physically harmed. Being a female by myself hearing those stories, I usually had my boyfriend stay the night with me if he was able to. When he wasn't, I always made sure to lock my bedroom door. First thing I did when I moved in was to put a real locking doorknob on mine. One morning I woke up and noticed some dirt on the carpet in front of my room. I thought nothing of it since I had probably just dragged it in when I went upstairs after work the night before. I took my shower, got changed, and stayed upstairs for a while. When I went downstairs, I didn't notice anything at first. All the doors were locked and windows were closed. I went outside for whatever reason, and that's when I noticed the screen from my window was laying across the lawn. When I went inside, it finally dawned on me why there was mulch leading up the stairs to my room. Basically, someone had broken into my house, and I am assuming if it weren't for my locked bedroom, I would have seen some creepy dude that night. The worst was when I reported it to security. Since nothing was stolen and I didn't actually see anything, they didn't investigate at all. Story 17. Okay, so this happened to me when I was little, which leads to the following story from before I was born. I was maybe 3 or 4 years old. Sometimes when I'd wake up in the morning, I would see my mom on the other side of the room just looking at me. Sometimes she'd be in her work uniform, and sometimes in her everyday clothes. Whenever I would see her just standing there, I would say her name, Mommy, and she'd disappear. Now, it never bothered me, being as young as I was, so I just learned saying her name would make her disappear, so I started reaching out to her. She'd still disappear, but slower. This went on sporadically for a couple months. Then it stopped. My mom is very much alive, and in days I would see her in her work clothes, she'd be at work, and on days when she was wearing her everyday clothes, she was food shopping, but she was never home. My dad or my brother was home. I never mentioned it to anyone when it happened because it just didn't seem that weird to me. I was a weird kid. Cut to me in middle school, and I'm checking out books about the supernatural from the library. I come across something called astral projection. I read a couple stories about it and go, wow, that sounds exactly like what happened to me. So I go to my dad. He seemed more into this stuff than my mom, and I showed him the book and told him my story. His face went a little pale, and he told me this story. Back when I was in the Navy and your mom and I were living in North Carolina, we had these neighbors that we used to hang out with all the time. Well, one night your mom and I are watching TV, and your mom decides to braid her hair. It was a hot night, and she usually leaves her hair down, but it was sticking to her neck. So she braids it, lays down on the couch next to me, and falls asleep. About an hour later, the neighbors call in a panic. The phone ringing wakes your mom up. "Scott, where's Sandy? She was sleeping next to me, but she just woke up." "Why? What's wrong?" Scott, Kathy, and I were laying down in bed when we both looked at the foot of the bed, and Sandy was there staring at us, except her hair was up. We've never seen her with her hair up before, but it definitely looked like her. Kathy asked her if something was wrong, and she disappeared. That was the end of my dad's story. He said he'd only ever heard of it happening that one time, and he was sure they were high or something. It didn't think it could have been true until I told him my story. That's the end of my creepy story. But around the time I got into the supernatural, I also got into finding out about my family's past. Genealogy, if you will. I found out my great-grandmother was Native American. My mother's father was considered half Native American. So my mom is 1/4 Native American. I started doing a little research of my own into Native American folklore, and I found it could be interesting that some Native American tribes didn't just have shamans for healing the physically ill. They had something called dream walkers who could enter their own dreams or dreams of others and either help get rid of demons from bad dreams, see the future, or go back to the physical plane but be somewhere completely different from where their body was. I don't know if my great-grandmother was a dream walker, but if she was, that seems to have passed down through the family. Story 18. About 5 years ago, my mom, twin, and I went to our local Hobby Lobby to get supplies for a project. Whilst browsing, my twin noticed a little tube of expensive gold leaf paint, which she desperately wanted for decorating her trifold based off of Queen Elizabeth I. Naturally, after looking at the price, my mother declined, and my twin was so distraught that she ran off somewhere in the store. I browsed with my mom a while longer, and when we got all the things we needed, she told me to fetch my sister. I trudged around the store, peeking through the long aisles, trying to get a glimpse of my twin. While looking, I noticed my arm would feel tight at certain times and almost hurt, like someone was squeezing it. Of course, being my little middle schooler self going through those pesky pubescent changes, I shook it off as a growth spurt. I finally spotted my twin dashing through the fake flower aisle at a high speed, like she was either chasing someone or being chased. Confused, I followed her, and when I finally got to her, she was hastily unwrapping a decorative sponge from its netting and placing it into a large and ornate vase. I know she uses Reddit, but I don't know what her username is, so I'm just going to call her by her nickname. I said, "Mel, what are you doing? We have to leave now. And why did you put a sponge in a vase? I'm pretty sure you can't do that." She grabbed my thin arms and tugged me away while saying, "No time to explain here. I'll tell you when it's safe." And before I could respond, she hurried me to a corner of the store far away from the vase. When we caught our breath, she told me that there was a ghost of a little boy there. Now, my sister has always had paranormal experiences, but this was only the second out of 4 major paranormal encounter her and I have witnessed at this time. I have great stories about the other times. One is super scary and has haunted my sister and I for years. Of course, I asked her about the ghost, and she explained that it was a little boy, no more than 7 or 8. She described his appearance. Think Newsies, dirty high socks and scuffed black shoes. One of those lopsided hats and suspenders. She went on to say that when she ran off, she sat in an aisle, and this little boy came up and started talking to her. She talked back and realized that people were looking at her strangely, which was when she took a closer look at his clothes. Apparently, he and his family died in a car accident way back when near the building's property, and he just sort of wandered there and hasn't left, though he can't find his parents. He brought up the idea of a game, suggesting that they take turns hiding the sponge and then finding it. While explaining, she suddenly stopped talking, cocked her head, then smiled at me, saying that he had found the sponge and hid it again, and we had to find it. I started looking everywhere, and I found it. The same sponge in a Chinese chest. When I picked it up, I got goosebumps and heard a small hooray come from my left. I turned and saw the dirty and dimpled face of a cute little boy. He smiled at me before fading away. Of course, by now I was shaking, and when I went to Melissa with the sponge, she told me he knew we had to go, and he was sad that we were leaving. At the checkout line, my mom noticed my arm, taking it into her hands and examining it, asking why I was so blotchy. I remembered the strange squeezing feeling and noticed that my arm wasn't just blotchy. The red marks were little handprints. The little boy had tried to lead me to Melissa. I looked back to see the boy waving goodbye and crying, "I'll never forget him." Story 19. My mom was close friends with this guy since childhood, my Uncle Danny. One night my family was having a 4th of July party. I was maybe 7. The adults were all drinking, him included. If he was sober, I don't think he would have told me this story. When he was 10 years old, his twin brother was playing at the park down the road from their house. Danny had to stay behind and finish chores because he was in trouble. Anyway, later he went to go get his brother from the park, call him in for dinner. He walked down the road and, When he got to the park, he saw his brother hanging from a tree and two other kids running out of the other side of the park. He ran to his brother and tried to hold him up so the rope would slack and he could breathe. Or if he lifted him up, he thought his brother might be able to climb back onto the branch. His brother was bigger than him as it was, and Danny was a scrawny kid. He screamed for help while trying to lift his brother, but in the end, he wasn't strong enough. He always stays fit now because of this. Story 20, 2003, 11YO. I was in hospital for a bone disease called osteomyelitis. I met a friend who was in my ward for 4 weeks. Week after week, I made friends, and they healed and were set free, haha. But this one cool dude was the nicest friend I have ever had. Sadly, whatever happened when he was born, he was as hard to say the words, but his shoulder would be near, his pecs chest are, ribs turned, knees not straight. Long story short, he always knew he wouldn't live a full life. His mother and father were alcoholics and substance addicts, so he lost them at age 4 and got a foster mother. Always bullied in school for how he looked, walked and acted, and for what his parents were. He was in hospital for surgery after surgery, and before his last op, he said to me, "Graham, if you're gone by the time I come back, I just want to say thanks for being my first and only best friend, and please take this as a gift." He handed me rosary beads and a picture he drew of me. I know he had one amazing talent, art. I woke up that next morning to his foster mother crying at my bed. He passed away during the last operation. I felt so shocked and saddened by the fact. But the mother turned and thanked me for giving him some joy before he left. And as she said, because you were his only friend. What an amazing kid he was. Story 21. My friend's grandma told me this one. She was born a little after WW1 in Germany. I don't recall the name of her village, but it was a small town. They lived very close to the eastern border of the country, near the Czech Republic. The Second World War had started, and her village had been relatively untouched by it up until where our story takes place. This had been a village near a very woodsy area. A lot of rivers, hills, lakes. For a few weeks, Russian planes had been flying overhead. Most of the townspeople just stayed inside when they saw them. One day during the winter, after a heavy snow, she and the other town kids had taken to sledding down this particularly big hill. Her older sister and younger brother were playing too. They then heard the plane engines overhead, and most kids got to running down the hill for home. Her sister had told her to hide in the bushes while she went to go find their younger brother. A few moments passed, and then the shooting started. She said she had heard projectiles piercing through the air and the sounds of the other children yelling, crying. She was frozen with terror and stayed hidden in the bushes. When she emerged, she saw the whole hill covered in red. Most of the kids playing that day now covered the hill, barely alive or not moving. Her siblings died that day on the hill. She says it is the one thing she will never be able to forget seeing. Story 22. Not a ghost story, but it still freaks me out to think about. I work at a woman's shelter, and I have so many more war stories than this one, and we had 2 women come in together. One of the women was in her 50s, the other in her early 20s. They told us the older woman was the aunt of the younger one, and the niece had gotten involved with a gang member who was threatening both the niece and aunt. They were both a little off, but all the caseworkers have seen worse, so we roll with it and do our best. A few days later, the niece completely flips out at some of the other residents, screaming about how one of them was flirting with her aunt, and she'll harm them. She'll harm everyone here, and starts throwing kitchen chairs across the room. One of the other caseworkers tries to calm this woman down while I call 911. By the time the police arrived, the niece had been calmed down, but both the niece and the aunt were escorted out of the shelter by the police. About 3 months later, my coworker comes in to work with the newspaper and shows us a story about these 2 women, the aunt and niece. According to the article, they were actually partners and not related at all, and were known to move from shelter to shelter and had just been arrested for harming a man they were living with.